Germany, Europe's biggest economy, the Chancellor Olaf Scholz has called the new U.S. tariffs fundamentally wrong.
We were told America led the EV revolution. That was a lie. Because overnight, Germany, France, and Denmark didn't just fight back, they buried the U.S. auto industry alive. This isn't a trade dispute. This is a calculated, coordinated economic takedown, and it's targeting the one thing America thought it controlled: the future of the car. While the headlines babbled about tariffs, Berlin issued a kill order. American electric vehicles banned from government contracts. Subsidies slashed. Showroom floors cleared. And the real power move? It didn't stop at Germany. France struck next, then Denmark. And now, the U.S. auto sector is spiraling. Why did Europe turn its back on Tesla, Ford, and General Motors? What secret deals are forming behind America's back? And how does Elon Musk fit into all of this? Stick around, because this is just about cars. The $110 billion tariff decision. France didn't just join Germany, they escalated it to a full-blown economic assault. Within days of Germany's fleet ban, the French government announced an unprecedented 25% tariff on all automobile imports from the United States. This wasn't a threat, it wasn't posturing, it was law. The announcement landed like a bombshell in Detroit, where General Motors and Ford executives scrambled to understand the scale of the disaster. France had long been one of the top European markets for American vehicles. That market was now officially closed. But Paris wasn't finished. In a coordinated press conference, French President Emmanuel Macron revealed a new strategic alliance with Renault and Stellantis. France would redirect all federal and municipal contracts to these homegrown automakers. More importantly, the government promised massive subsidies and public investment to ensure that European electric vehicles would completely replace American imports on French roads. The political framing was ruthless but effective. France wasn't just retaliating, it was defending European jobs. The narrative spread quickly across French media outlets, framing American electric vehicles as a threat to Europe's economic independence. Within days, public opinion polls showed a sharp decline in French consumer interest toward American brands. And while Germany and France tightened the screws, what Denmark did was far more personal. But before we talk about what they did, hit the subscribe button. Denmark blacklists Tesla. Denmark didn't just blacklist Tesla, they made Elon Musk the villain of Europe. While Germany and France had focused on broad economic retaliation, Denmark took aim at a single American company and its controversial leader. The Danish Financial Supervisory Authority delivered a brutal announcement. Two of Denmark's largest pension funds would immediately divest from Tesla, citing ethical concerns. Academic Pension and Pension Denmark, managing billions of dollars in retirement savings, declared Tesla an excluded entity due to labor disputes, anti-union practices, and political entanglements. But the attack didn't stop there. Denmark's Trade and Industry Ministry followed up by slashing electric vehicle consumer rebate programs, explicitly excluding any vehicle manufactured by an American automaker. For the average Danish consumer, this meant that buying a Tesla or a General Motors electric vehicle would suddenly cost thousands of dollars more than purchasing a European-made alternative. The Danish media framed the decision as a stand against foreign political interference. Headlines declared Tesla a vehicle of American hegemony, while commentators cited Elon Musk's alignment with far-right European parties and close ties to President Trump as a direct threat to European values. The public backlash was swift. Tesla dealerships in Denmark reported mass order cancellations, and online forums filled with calls to boycott American vehicles entirely. But this wasn't just about Europe's retaliation. The entire United States auto industry was now at risk. The $219 billion and $500 million meltdown begins. What started as tariffs exploded into a full-scale trade disaster. By the time Denmark's blacklist took effect, economists were already sounding alarms. A comprehensive analysis by the International Trade Council revealed that Germany, France, and Denmark's coordinated policies put more than $219 billion and $500 million worth of United States automobile exports at immediate risk. The numbers were staggering. American automakers exported more than $110 billion of vehicles to Europe in the previous year alone. Those exports were now facing 25% tariffs, canceled fleet contracts, and erased consumer incentives. For companies like Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, this wasn't just a setback, it was an existential threat. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within a matter of weeks, General Motors reported a projected revenue loss of $14 billion. Ford's estimates stood at $6 billion. Tesla's market valuation plummeted as European pension funds dumped their holdings and retail customers walked away in droves. But the economic damage didn't stop at corporate boardrooms. In states like Michigan and Ohio, factory managers announced the first round of mass layoffs. Supply chain disruptions triggered temporary shutdowns across assembly plants in Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana. Auto parts suppliers, many of them small businesses, began filing for bankruptcy at an alarming rate. The domino effect was undeniable. American dealerships, already struggling under the weight of inflation and rising production costs, faced an avalanche of canceled orders. Consumer confidence collapsed. In rural towns dependent on manufacturing jobs, the news triggered panic. Community leaders warned of an economic downturn not seen since the financial crisis of 2008. And while the United States auto industry scrambled to contain the fallout, President Trump was not preparing to de-escalate. Instead, he was about to make things much worse. Trump's economic blitz, the tariff that broke the industry. Trump promised protection, but delivered economic chaos instead. When the Trump administration introduced sweeping tariffs on foreign-made vehicles and auto parts, the goal was clear: bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil and punish countries that, according to Trump, exploited American markets. But what followed was nothing short of an economic detonation that would ripple through every layer of the U.S. auto industry. The policy at the center of this storm was the 25% tariff imposed on imported vehicles and auto components from the European Union. On February 20, 2025, Trump signed an executive order declaring that foreign auto imports threatened national security, invoking the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 as justification. The order specifically targeted vehicles produced in Germany, France, and Denmark, countries he accused of destroying American industry. But the real destruction began at home. U.S. automakers immediately sounded the alarm. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis had built their entire supply chains around free trade with Europe, importing essential components such as transmissions, batteries, and advanced electronics. These new tariffs drove up their production costs by nearly 20% overnight, forcing them to either raise prices or absorb billions in losses. Ford executives warned that the cost of their most affordable models would spike by as much as $6,000 per vehicle. It did not take long for the European Union to respond. Germany, France, and Denmark filed an official complaint with the World Trade Organization, calling Trump's tariffs illegal and retaliatory. But while the legal challenge slowly moved through diplomatic channels, a much faster, more brutal retaliation was already underway, and it was about to cross the Atlantic. Canada's counterstrike, targeting Tesla and American brands. They did not just retaliate, they singled out Elon Musk and the U.S. auto industry. The Canadian government, led by the National Democratic Party and supported by newly empowered provincial leaders, delivered a surgical strike aimed directly at America's most valuable electric vehicle brand, Tesla. In March 2025, Canadian lawmakers proposed a $10,000 special tariff on all Tesla vehicles imported into Canada. But they did not stop there. The NDP introduced an aggressive rebate program that offered Canadian consumers a $10,000 incentive exclusively for electric vehicles manufactured within Canadian borders. Any vehicle with American origin, including models from Tesla, Ford, and General Motors, was deliberately excluded from the new program. The Canadian government also removed Tesla from its federal grant programs, stripping the company of its eligibility for green technology subsidies. Overnight, Tesla's prices in Canada skyrocketed, while local brands and Canadian-made vehicles became dramatically cheaper and more attractive to buyers. The political message behind these moves was unmistakable. Trump's tariffs would not go unanswered, and Canada would protect its own manufacturing industry at the expense of America's biggest auto giants. Elon Musk's political alignment with Trump only intensified the backlash, turning Tesla into a lightning rod for Canadian outrage. But the shockwaves were not limited to international relations. The real damage was about to surface back home, deep in the heart of Trump's most loyal strongholds. MAGA states in crisis, factory closures and broken promises. The heart of Trump's America was collapsing under his own policies. Across the Midwest and rural heartlands, the auto industry had been the lifeline of communities for generations. Trump's promise to protect these workers, to bring back the factories, and to restore American manufacturing had fueled his political rise. But by mid-2025, those promises lay in ruins. Factory closures swept through Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois like wildfire. Ford announced the shuttering of 2 major assembly plants, cutting more than 15,000 jobs. General Motors followed with 12,000 layoffs, many in counties that had overwhelmingly supported Trump in the previous election. In Indiana, an entire supply chain collapsed when European auto parts shipments dried up under the new tariffs, leaving small manufacturers bankrupt. The backlash was swift. In Ohio and Michigan, the United Auto Workers Union staged massive protests, blocking highways and demanding an immediate reversal of the tariff policies. Rural communities that had once rallied behind Trump's America First message now found themselves unemployed, uninsured, and facing economic devastation. And just when it seemed like it could not get worse, the financial markets delivered the most brutal blow of all. Wall Street's auto crash, $219.5 billion in freefall. In one brutal week, Wall Street erased decades of American auto dominance. As Europe, Canada, and other allies retaliated against Trump's tariffs, investors fled the U.S. auto sector in panic. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged by 800 points in a single day. The Standard & Poor's 500 Index and the NASDAQ Composite both fell by more than 2%, signaling a market correction. The automotive industry bore the brunt of the collapse. Tesla's market valuation dropped from $770 billion to $635 billion in less than a month, wiping out $135 billion in shareholder value. General Motors and Ford combined faced projected losses of $14 billion and $6 billion, respectively, as analysts slashed earnings forecasts and investors dumped their stocks. The financial carnage rippled across pensions, retirement funds, and local economies dependent on the auto sector. Small investors, factory workers, and everyday Americans watched helplessly as the value of their savings evaporated. The American dream, tied so deeply to car culture and manufacturing pride, was now being dismantled in real time. But Europe's retaliation was never just about tariffs. Behind the economic war lay something far more dangerous, a deliberate attempt to shift the balance of global power. And as the dust settled on Wall Street, that power play was only just beginning. The end of U.S. EV supremacy, Europe's new empire. While American brands crumbled under the weight of tariffs and trade backlash, Europe quietly built something far more dangerous, an electric vehicle empire that excludes the United States entirely. It began not with a speech, but with legislation. In the early months of 2025, Germany, France, and Denmark signed a sweeping set of policy agreements under the European Green Mobility Acceleration Act. The policy wasn't just environmental, it was surgical. It mandated that any electric vehicle sold within the European Union, if it were to qualify for public incentives, must be produced within the bloc and meet strict sustainability benchmarks. American automakers were effectively locked out. The announcement sent shockwaves through trade chambers in Detroit, Silicon Valley, and Washington. But in Europe, it was greeted as a long overdue correction. Leaders framed it not as retaliation, but as resilience, safeguarding European innovation from American interference. Suddenly, homegrown brands like Renault, Peugeot, and Volkswagen began posting record sales. In France, Renault's electric models outsold every foreign brand combined. In Germany, Volkswagen surpassed Tesla in market share for the first time since 2019. And in Denmark, a country once flooded with American EVs, Danish consumers began flocking to European models, spurred by both patriotic sentiment and generous tax incentives. But it wasn't just about policy, it was about values. While American companies battled labor unions and chased short-term stock gains, European firms leaned into sustainability, union collaboration, and regional reinvestment. And consumers noticed. One Brussels official summarized it with brutal clarity. American EVs may have the technology, but Europe has the soul. And that shift was decisive. At the stroke of a pen, billions of dollars in American exports vanished from the European market, not because of a boycott, not because of tariffs, but because Europe decided to build its future without the United States in it. And at the center of that collapse, Elon Musk's own political gamble. The Elon Musk problem. From CEO to liability, Elon Musk was once seen as the visionary who made electric cars desirable. But in Europe, that image is dead. What remains is a fractured brand and a CEO whose political allegiances triggered a wave of rejection across the continent. The damage began in Germany, when Musk publicly praised the Alternative for Germany party, a far-right nationalist group tied to climate denial and anti-immigrant rhetoric, the backlash was instant. German media labeled him an American provocateur, and Tesla showrooms in Berlin were plastered with protest signs reading, "No fascism with our future." But Germany wasn't alone, and here's where it gets interesting, but if you're still watching and you haven't subscribed yet, please just take a few seconds and do it. Thanks. In France, Musk's support for Donald Trump became a lightning rod. Public trust in Tesla plummeted after Musk's statements defending Trump's trade war as visionary. In a country already reeling from retaliatory tariffs and job losses in the auto parts sector, this was viewed as nothing short of betrayal. Then came Denmark. The Danish government announced that Tesla would no longer qualify for federal EV grants. But the real story was the public. Citizens organized a nationwide petition to revoke Musk's honorary economic status, a rare designation given to foreign investors. Thousands signed it, and the message was loud and clear. Tesla no longer represented innovation. It represented American arrogance. Tesla's brand had always been tied to Musk's personal image, but now that image was toxic. Sales collapsed. Investor confidence faded. Tesla stock was blacklisted by several of Europe's largest pension funds, and news outlets began referring to the company not by its name, but by its CEO. Musk's collapse continues, read one French headline. Will the company survive its founder? Even Elon Musk's Canadian ties became a point of controversy. Lawmakers in Ottawa debated stripping Tesla of its eligibility for Canada's Green Investment Fund, citing Musk's destabilizing behavior in the global trade space. Across Europe, Tesla was no longer a car company. It was a political symbol, and in this case, that symbol was driving straight off a cliff. But the economic collapse was only part of the fallout, because Europe's retaliation wasn't just defensive, it was the foundation for something much bigger. Europe's new trade alliance, the anti-American bloc. Germany, France, and Denmark were never just acting alone. Behind the scenes, they were building a new kind of trade alliance, one that cut the United States out completely. In a stunning policy pivot, the European Commission began exploring cross-border agreements with Canada and Mexico, two countries that had been caught in the middle of Donald Trump's trade war. But this time, they weren't negotiating for U.S. market access. They were coordinating a plan to bypass the United States altogether. The new framework would allow for tariff-free electric vehicle and auto part exchanges between the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, so long as no U.S. components were used. And with Trump's tariffs still in place, that proposal gained traction fast. Canada's Prime Minister and Mexico's Economic Minister held back-to-back meetings in Brussels, discussing supply chain realignment, green tech investments, and localized manufacturing hubs. A leaked draft agreement even proposed joint development zones in Quebec and Bavaria for zero-emission vehicle production, funded entirely without U.S. participation. Meanwhile, the World Trade Organization convened an emergency session after the United States refused to retract its 25% auto tariffs. But for the first time in years, the usual allies didn't rally behind Washington. Instead, they rallied around one another. A quiet shift was taking place, away from globalization, and toward what analysts now call strategic regionalism. And in this new era, the United States was viewed not as a partner, but as a wild card. Diplomatically, America found itself isolated. At a time when global coordination was needed to stabilize inflation, restructure supply chains, and rebuild trust, the White House doubled down on protectionism, and Europe decided to move on without them. But the ultimate betrayal didn't come from Europe. It came from within. Trump's power grab, the executive orders that shattered trust. While the world reacted to the trade chaos, Donald Trump quietly signed a series of executive orders that stunned even his closest allies. And when the truth emerged, it set Washington on fire. The first was a March order invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to authorize the deportation of nearly 300 Venezuelan immigrants, labeling them economic extremists. The order was signed, published in the Federal Register, and acted upon within 48 hours. But then Trump denied it. "I don't know when that was signed," he told reporters. "Other people handled it." The contradiction was explosive. His signature was on the order. His spokesperson confirmed it. Yet Trump disowned it entirely. Legal experts were horrified. The act hadn't been invoked since the Second World War, and never without a formal declaration of war. In a federal courtroom, a Department of Justice lawyer admitted, "We were simply executing instructions. We weren't given full information." That admission sent chills through the legal community. But while that scandal unfolded, Trump signed a second, even more controversial set of executive actions. stripping workplace protections for federal contractors, eliminating wage transparency requirements, and suspending collective bargaining rights at defense production facilities. The effect was immediate. Union leaders condemned the orders. Legal scholars called it an authoritarian abuse of administrative power, and for millions of American workers, it was a signal that their president had turned on them. Chaos erupted inside the White House. Internal memos leaked, showing that several of the orders had been drafted by outside consultants, including members of Elon Musk's private transition advisory group. That revelation broke the dam. Accusations flew. Was the executive branch now being outsourced to billionaires? Had policy been shaped to benefit Tesla and Starlink while undermining labor rights? The political fallout was swift and devastating. But what happened next sent shockwaves through the entire global economy. The labor revolt. Unions declare war on Trump and Musk. America's workers finally snapped, and they took the fight to Washington. For months, factory workers, port employees, and auto technicians had watched as their livelihoods were shredded by a trade war they never asked for. But it wasn't until Germany, France, and Denmark shut out the United States auto industry that the dam finally broke. The first strike erupted in Detroit. The United Auto Workers declared an unprecedented nationwide walkout, citing not only falling wages and mass layoffs, but also what they called the systematic betrayal by Donald Trump's tariff policies. Within days, port workers in New Jersey, California, and Louisiana joined them, shutting down critical supply chains. The message was clear. American labor had been sacrificed on the altar of political gamesmanship, and they weren't going to take it anymore. But it wasn't just happening at home. Across the Atlantic, labor unions in Germany and France, historically at odds with their American counterparts, announced a formal alliance with the United Auto Workers. Together, they launched a coordinated boycott of U.S. auto brands, refusing to load, unload, or distribute American-made vehicles throughout European ports. In Denmark, unions went a step further, calling for the suspension of contracts with Tesla until Elon Musk publicly apologized for supporting policies that triggered the crisis. For the first time in modern history, labor movements in Europe and North America united against American corporate giants and their political enablers. But while workers fought back, investors fled. Global markets panicked, a $3.6 trillion meltdown. What started as a trade war became a full-blown financial catastrophe. The strikes, boycotts, and consumer protests sent Wall Street into a tailspin. On the morning after the United Auto Workers announced their indefinite strike, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by 780 points. The Standard & Poor's 500 index dropped by nearly 3%. The Nasdaq Composite followed, slipping by over 2.5%. But the real shock came when the total market losses were tallied. Within 48 hours, over $3.6 trillion in global market value had evaporated. It wasn't just auto stocks. Banks, construction firms, tech companies, and commodities all suffered sharp declines. The collapse of the American auto sector triggered classic recession indicators. Bond yields fell. Consumer confidence indexes hit their lowest point since 2008. Small businesses tied to the auto supply chain began shuttering overnight, and ordinary Americans felt it immediately. Mortgage rates spiked. Grocery prices rose. Gas stations quietly adjusted their prices upward as fuel imports became entangled in retaliatory tariffs. But amid the chaos, a question no one wanted to ask lingered in the air. Had the American auto industry just passed the point of no return? Is this the death of American industry? The world stopped buying American cars. But will they ever start again? The structural damage inflicted by the trade war went deeper than quarterly losses. For decades, the United States auto industry had been built on three pillars: mass production, global distribution, and consumer trust. By the time Germany, France, and Denmark finished their economic offensive, all three pillars had collapsed. Factory closures across Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois became permanent. Small and medium-sized suppliers filed for bankruptcy at record rates. Entire communities dependent on auto manufacturing were left without jobs, healthcare, or pensions. But the financial consequences were only part of the story. Investors who once bet billions on Ford, General Motors, and Tesla began reallocating their capital. European and Asian markets, particularly in Germany, China, and South Korea, saw a surge in foreign direct investment as Wall Street abandoned American manufacturers. Consumer sentiment collapsed alongside the stock market. Surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center revealed that over 65% of American consumers no longer trusted U.S. automakers to deliver affordable, reliable vehicles. And as the dust settled, one undeniable truth remained. The trade war had not just damaged the American auto industry, it had broken it. Even the World Trade Organization, once a tool of American influence, convened a special session to discuss sanctions against the United States for violating international trade norms. Washington found itself diplomatically isolated, economically weakened, and politically divided. Can America ever recover? The trade war wasn't just an economic battle, it marked the collapse of American industrial power. Now the world isn't asking if America can win, it's asking, can American industry ever recover? What do you think? Thanks for watching and comment your thoughts down below.